Tonight, I hope I don't offend anybody because I'm going to be talking a little bit about the difference between men and women. And you are aware that there are differences, and there are some things that God created that we don't even think about. In fact, I'm going to guarantee before you leave tonight, you are going to hear something you've never heard before. And now here's the deal. Sometimes it sounds a little bit like an old familiar gender stereotype. But please carefully consider everything I'm going to tell you has a basis in biology. This is not my opinion. My wife will tell you I am the furthest thing from a male chauvinist pig. So everything I say has its roots in biology, and carefully think about that as we talk about gender differences and what the stereotypes may be and how they may have been around for 6,000 years, because that's how God created them. So with that warning, I'm hoping nobody throws anything at me. So, okay, tonight we are going to talk about, is God too binary? And to do that, we have to talk about what it means to be binary. Binary means relating to, composed of, or involving just two things. It's either this or it's that. There's nothing in between. Binary means there's never more than two options. In binary code, there's a 0 and a 1. Now, binary also means that your mobile phone is either on or off. So please turn it off. Now, there is a famous Wisconsin celebrity who decided to talk about this subject, and he says that God is too binary for him. And so we are going to show that video. I'm pretty sure you're going to recognize the face and the voice, so just enjoy the video and we'll go from there. Isn't it interesting that a guy who made millions of dollars in a very binary profession would think God and Christianity are too binary? Let's face it, in football, either you win or you lose. The pass is either complete or incomplete. You either make the first down or you don't. You either cross the goal line and score or you didn't. But the one thing I agree with him on is God is binary. And he's been binary ever since the beginning of creation. You were either on the ark or you weren't. Jesus said he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Well, at the judgment seat of Christ, everybody's going to be either a sheep or a goat. There's no mention of cattle or chicken. And when it comes to sin and salvation, God appears to be quite binary. Paul talks in Romans about the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Jesus Christ our Lord. And then John in the Revelation says, if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. It's pretty binary. So why is God binary? Well, reason number one, human beings are so erratic, impulsive, and depraved that God had to keep it simple. And that way, none of us has any excuse. And Adam and Eve tried several excuses. Now, I think I'm like a lot of people. I'm anxious to meet Adam and Eve someday and say, what part of forbidden fruit didn't you understand? But I suspect I will have to stand in a long line to do that. So, Aaron Rodgers thinks God is too binary, but he's not the only one. The transgender community also thinks God is too binary, but they do it for an entirely different set of reasons. You see, they consider the book of Genesis to be hate speech because God says he created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And as if to rub a little salt in the wound, he says he created males and females for a purpose. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, is what he told the first human beings. Now, if you don't believe me that it's considered hate speech, ask Vasilis Siartis, his name is. A retired soccer star was given a suspended 10-month jail term and a 5,000 euro fine for declaring on social media that men are men and women are women, just like God created them. So, is that going to happen in the United States? Time will tell. Anyway, this all stems from this thing we call gender dysphoria. I defined this at our last one, but I will do it again. It's a sense of discomfort or dissatisfaction or distress due to a mismatch between one's biological sex and their true gender identity. In other words, a mismatch occurs when one's body parts say you are male or female and your brain says you are something else. Now, what is that something else? Well, the non-binary advocates say gender is a sliding scale between two extremes. On the one extreme, we have Penei Sewell, the 6'6", 350-pound lineman from the Lions, who had his way with the Packers twice last season. And on the other end of the spectrum is the girly girl, Ms. Taylor Swift. Now, I confess to not knowing much about Taylor Swift, including what songs she sings, but I'm quite impressed that the ticket price of one of her concerts set off a congressional investigation. So, is the presumption, though, that the rest of us fit somewhere in between there? That's a good question. And what about a guy like Willie Shoemaker? He stood 4'10" and weighed 91 pounds. Is he less male than Penei Sewell is? And what about Kate Smith, who did sing a song that I remember very well? Is she any less female because she's not Taylor Swift? Now, another question, just how many genders are there? Are there 2? Are there 4? Are there 57? Or are there 72? And if you have any doubt that there are 72 genders, look at this website, and some guy named every 72 and wrote a description of each of them. Who has time for that? I don't know, but somebody did. Or is it possible that because there are 8 billion people on the planet, there are 8 billion different genders, minus identical twins, of course. We presume they're the same gender. Now, speaking of identical twins, a 15-year study in Sweden demonstrated that there is probably not a genetic component to gender dysphoria. They found no instance in which both identical twins had been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Now, non-binary advocates feel that they must reject biblical creation and that they must embrace evolution because it's the only alternative to what they consider hate speech. And evolution is all too willing to accommodate them. See, gender has been established as an evolutionary adaptation that humans likely created in order to organize themselves into a society. It is understood that gender identity is constantly evolving and is not established at birth, but actually is a byproduct of our human experience as we grow and develop. Notice there's not a lot of science in that. So when you ask about the science, they go back to their old mantra. According to evolution, random mutations and natural selection have forged this mismatch between body parts and gender identity. And it just kind of fits with it that non-binary gender identification assumes a certain level of genetic randomness, kind of like a roll of the dice. So which one is it? Are human beings non-binary because of natural evolutionary progression? Or are we quite binary because of supernatural divine creativity. Well, let's start by asking what is similar and what is different between these four people. Let's start with ladies first. What Kate Smith and Taylor Swift have in common is that they were both born with a lot of reproductive cells that we will call eggs. They were born with anywhere from 1 to 2 million of them, but by puberty they're down to under 500,000. By age 32 it's about 120,000, by age 37 down to 25,000, and by 52 they usually start menopause because they're under 1,000. Now, just so you know what a sensitive kind of guy I am, I want to tell you about how I learned about menopause. I was in my 30s at the time, and a regular patient came in, and I was checking her teeth, and I said, "Lisa, do you have any idea how you got these pits on your front teeth?" And without a moment's hesitation, she looked at me and said, "Doc, it's got to be the menopause." I said, "Lisa, what does menopause have to do with your teeth?" She says, "Probably nothing, but it sure is the pits." So that's how I learned about menopause. Now, Willie Shoemaker and Panay Sewell, both of these males contain what we call a reproductive factory. It's like an assembly line, and it makes turbocharged sperm cells. They've got a mitochondrial generator, and they have a flagella along with seminal fluid to help. And this flagella acts like a propeller to take them where they want to go. We call this a perpetual prolific production because they make 1,500 sperm cells a second for the rest of their life. Maybe it slows down a little, but not much. But that's okay because, as it turns out, they discharge anywhere from 100 to 300 million sperm cells every time they release them. Now, before I go on, I just want to assume that everybody in this room knows how a sperm cell gets in close proximity to an egg. You see, this talk is about sperm and eggs, not the birds and the bees. So, I had that talk with my son once, and I don't ever want to do it again. This is a little video to help us understand about what it's like when the sperm cell lands where it's supposed to go, because it immediately falls under attack. We've now decided to change the talk to baby turtles. Everybody seems to be on the side of the turtles. It's a great video, isn't it? The similarity between the turtles and the sperm cells is that the female immune system has these giant white blood cells, at least giant compared to sperm cells. And you can see the only way the sperm cells survive is to outnumber the white blood cells. And the hope is that at least one of them gets to the cervix so that they can escape the immune system. Why is there such an immune system? Well, it's to get rid of microorganisms. And these microorganisms are exactly what the sperm cells are. This very primitive drawing demonstrates another problem that the sperm cells have. The female reproductive canal is mildly acidic, and it does that again to keep microorganism count down, and especially helps with STDs. pH scale, 7 is neutral, 1 to 6 is acidic, 8 to 14 is alkaline. So the minuses in this little circle correspond to acidic, and then the pluses correspond to alkaline. You see, this seminal fluid that comes with the sperm cells completely encases them, and it wraps them in it and protects them, And on top of that, because it's mildly alkaline, it balances the acidity, and that way these sperm cells can safely swim to where they have to go. Now here's my question. If these parts all evolved, how did the sperm factory know that the semen had to be alkaline? How did it know that it was going to run into acid on the other side? And on top of that, how did it know just how many sperm cells it would have to send? There was no information about white blood cells being transmitted. Interesting thought, isn't it? And that brings us to the cervix. The cervix is an amazing invention. It's like a heavy-duty garage door. And it has to be heavy-duty because it supports the weight of the baby for 9 months. And so it's got to be pretty durable. But then at the right time, it has to open. But it doesn't open like a normal garage door. Instead of opening up or down or side to side, it opens from the inside out. And this is a cervical dilation chart. I don't know whether women find this interesting or not. Maybe it brings back too many memories. So we won't talk about labor and delivery, but it just shows what has to happen for that baby to be born. Because if the cervix doesn't work and the baby is stuck there forever, neither the mom or the baby are going to be very happy. But there's one other time that the cervix has to open, and that's during this process of ovulation. Now, I know there's a lot here. I'll go through it real quick. The hypothalamus in the brain checks its monthly calendar, says it's time to send a message to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland makes follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, sends it to the ovary. The ovary takes those hormones and releases an egg to migrate down the fallopian tube. Now, the egg does not have any legs or a tail like the sperm cell does, so little finger projections within the fallopian tube have to carry it, like body passing in a mosh pit. That's how it works. Now, the ovary, on the other hand, has to send estrogen, a real surge of estrogen, and it acts like an automatic garage door opener to open the cervix. Because if the cervix doesn't open, the sperm cells can't get in to fertilize the egg. Now, you are not going to be tested on any of that. What I want you to do is just take a look at the big picture here. Look at all of this stuff that's going on. There's 5 organs, there's 3 major hormones, and every one of them has to be in total sync. Every one of them has to do exactly what it's supposed to at exactly the right time and in exactly the right amount, or there is no fertilization. Now, this is a rhetorical question. Do you think random mutations and natural selection can make that kind of precision happen? I think you know the answer to that one. Well, once it gets past the cervix, the sperm cell needs to find the egg. Fortunately, it has a chemical egg detector that works like a GPS. Now, me and my GPS are not on good terms right now because it took me through downtown Chicago to get to Midway Airport. Everybody knows that's the wrong way to do it except my GPS. Now, having said that, my GPS is still loaded with information. Now, where does information come from? Well, everybody knows information needs to come from an intelligent source. Now, where is that intelligence? Well, it certainly wasn't the sperm factory. That's nothing but an assembly line. So where did that intelligence come from? Now, moving right along, once the sperm cell gets to the zona pellucida, or zona pellucida if you're Spanish, it's a thick covering around the egg that has to be penetrated before fertilization can take place. Now, this little sperm cell is no match for this thing, but it has been equipped with something in its head. This head is called the acrosome, and it has digestive enzymes in it that tunnel through this zona pellucida like an ice auger goes through ice. Now, how, out of 1,000 possibilities, did these digestive enzymes happen to be just the right ones to get through this matrix of carbohydrates protecting the cell. And then, once it gets through, it has to combine with the membrane of the egg in such a way that fertilization takes place. But that comes through these very intricate connections on the proteins. It's like these little amino acids have to fit together very precisely, like the back of a desktop computer. And in the same way that you have to connect the power cord and the monitor and the mouse and all this stuff, those same two, the sperm and the egg, have to connect just like that. Now, how did the sperm and the egg know how to have just the right connections? Interesting thought, isn't it? Well, in the same way that your computer comes to life when you make all the right connections, so it is when this connection is made for fertilization. As soon as it happens, it deploys an army of molecules to prevent other sperm cells from getting into the egg. And sounds interesting, doesn't it? Well, at the same time, there's an infusion of calcium cells, like millions of calcium ions, that show up in the area so that they can build a wall around the egg so that no additional sperm can get in. So, why is this so important? Well, as it turns out, you've heard the explanation. 2 is company, 3 is a crowd. In this case, 2 is company, and 3 is a disaster. And see, embryonic fertilization has to be a binary process because the presence of more than one sperm cell causes genetic chaos. Now, what does genetic chaos look like? Like this. Now, he's cute and he's friendly, but I don't think this is what Mom had in mind when she came home from the hospital. See, genetic chaos would destroy the human race, and that's reason number 2 why God is binary. See, procreation must be completely binary. 1 egg, 1 sperm cell. No more, no less. See, this process must advance in perfect order for life to begin. There is no room for error. If just one step fails, there will be no new life. It's all or nothing. In fact, this is the very definition of binary. Evolution, on the other hand, says that it's all a matter of trial and error over long periods of time. The problem for trial and error, though, is that it implies feedback and adjustment. But with procreation, where does the feedback come from? The sperm cells don't have a mechanism to provide feedback for what went wrong. Even if they did, who would they report to? The sperm factory is nothing more than an assembly line. As for the egg, it only receives information. It has no way of reporting system failure. See, this process had to be precise and perfect the very first time because there is no mechanism for trial and error. There are just so many complex pieces and processes, and just on the female side. For example, how does one set of cells know it had to evolve into an ovary? Well, another set of cells evolved into a fallopian tube, and yet another evolved into a uterus. How do these cells know what they're supposed to do? You know, it's not like they can talk to each other on their cell phone. And why would female parts evolve for thousands of years with no guarantee of someone to mate with? It's actually kind of laughable, isn't it? See, does a girl get dressed for the prom if she doesn't have a date? Would Chevrolet have designed a Corvette before gasoline was invented? You see, evolution knows it's in trouble when it comes to explaining procreation. So they've invented this rescuing device called teleonomy. Now, teleonomy is the apparent purposefulness of structure or function in living organisms due to evolutionary adaptation. It is called the ghost in the machinery that guides random mutations and natural selection. Ghost in the machinery, guiding random mutations and natural selection. That's a little bit of an oxymoron. If they are random and natural, they're not, if they're being guided. And what about this ghost in the machinery? Well, it makes a very nice soundbite. But if you ask, what does it really mean? Nobody can tell you. There is no science behind it. And I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but that's how evolution stays alive, is with sound bites. They just put something out there, the media picks it up, publicizes it, and then we have to give a long explanation to say why that soundbite is incorrect. Frankly, that's why they're winning the battles. But that's why we exist at CSSM, to provide the explanations. In any case, what teleonomy really is, it's an admission on the part of scientists that a carefully designed blueprint is required to make procreation work. So they credit Mother Nature for the apparent purposefulness and foresight, but refuse to acknowledge the influence of Father God. And here's the problem with mutations. Mutations are usually harmful or neutral, says Dr. Georgia Purdom. She's saying, I have never seen evidence of a truly beneficial mutation. And there's a reason for that, is that a human organism, or any organism, is like a masterpiece. It is designed about as well as it can be. It's a masterpiece like the Mona Lisa. Now, what can you change on the Mona Lisa that would make it any better? Now, some people might think this is an improvement because blondes have more fun, but I think most people would disagree. This is definitely not an improvement, even if it does make her look like Jesus. So, mutations. The entire theory of evolution rests on the ability of random mutations to make things better. But when you follow the real science, this is clearly not what happens. That's why the conversation often shifts to natural selection. Now, natural selection is what Charles Darwin came up with as he went around the Galapagos Islands looking at finch beaks. It's called the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to biological differences. There's a mouthful. Well, I'm going to give you the Wisconsin version of natural selection. Natural selection starts with a black squirrel on a lighter colored pavement. Because of that, he or she is going to survive and procreate because it can be seen a block away, and people will do their best to keep from running it over. On the other hand, if the same black squirrel is on black pavement, the driver won't see the squirrel until it's about to be run over. It won't survive, it won't procreate, and there won't be black squirrels pretty soon. What there will be is a lot of light gray squirrels, because you can see them from a block away on black pavement, and they will proliferate. And on the far right side, you see the downside of natural selection. When a medium gray squirrel tries to cross a medium gray street, well, you get the picture. What really is needed for procreation is foresight. And this is what Marcos Eberlin says in his book, Foresight. It's a really good book, but he uses a lot of big words, so be prepared. Let me read this carefully. Have you ever read a scientific paper explaining how a process like reproduction could possibly come together one small, blind, evolutionary step at a time? You got that? He says, well, don't feel bad. No one has. In reality, it must have come together not through blind evolution, but through foresight and careful preparation. See, as far as I'm concerned, he's put the final nail in the coffin. Heterosexual procreation, there's just no way that evolution can explain it. And to me, this is the demise of evolution. Rest in peace. See, human procreation is just far too complex for evolution to explain, but it's just so common and so consistent that there are 8 billion of us alive today. There has to be a better explanation. And there is. To be fruitful and multiply requires 2 genders. Not 4, not 57 or 72 or 8 billion. Just 2. And made in God's image means we were created, male and female, to raise the next generation. Now, there are some male and female differences, and I'd like to go through some of these, starting at the top. Did you know that men have harder heads than women? I don't see anybody disagreeing. Well, it is true. Male skulls are larger, thicker, and have more defined muscle attachments. This came in very handy last year during the drought in the Southwest when Lake Mead began to dry up. As the water receded, they started finding skeletons. They found 6 skeletons in all, human skeletons, that had been dropped into Lake Mead for who knows what reason. Well, the first step in identifying these skeletons was to determine, is it male or female? And they were able to easily do this when they had an intact skull to work with. See, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So why do men have harder heads? Well, because men are designed to be warriors. And they are made larger, stronger, faster, and now you also know they also have harder heads. So they are made to be the warriors. But why didn't God give women such durable skulls? I mean, why is it that not only is the skull more fragile, but they have twice the number of nerve endings in their face and in their head than men do? That way they're far more sensitive to pain and touch sensations. Well, you see, women weren't made to be the warriors. God designed women for nurturing and comforting. Just look at the face on this mother. You know, she's enjoying this as much as the baby is. And that's a good thing, because research has shown that children who don't have significant physical contact with their mother will have significantly smaller brains by age 3, and they are more prone to mental health problems and will have lower intelligence. So it is good that God made women the way he made them. And it's okay for males to snuggle their kids or their grandkids. Just have to be careful that he doesn't traumatize them. Now, at this point, my wife said to me, "Isn't this a little bit gender stereotypical?" And I said, "Yes, but what part of this didn't God create?" You know, the man is clearly larger, stronger, and the noggin more durable. That's why men are supposed to fight the battles, and women are supposed to mind the children. Sounds stereotypical, but who made it that way? And then there's this thing that the skull protects that we call the brain. For women, thinking happens as they interconnect by going from side to side with their brain waves, and that's how they exchange information, from side to side, rather than men who tend to exchange information with sides of the brain from front to back. Now, this means a whole lot of things, but Bill and Pam Farrell wrote a book about it that kind of sums it all up. It's called Men Are Waffles, Women Are Spaghetti. What they mean by that is that men tend to handle life one compartment at a time, like a waffle. We are usually very good at solving one problem, but if you give us two to handle, we'll probably mess them both up. Women, on the other hand, are more like a plate of spaghetti where every strand of life touches every other strand of life. It makes women much better at multitasking, but it also makes their life a little more complicated. I'm thinking of just the word holiday. If you say that to a group, the men are thinking about the next holiday. The women are probably thinking about all 12 of them. That's just the way they process. It's neither good nor bad. They're just different. And it is true that we're going to focus on the eyes for a minute, no pun intended. And women, by research, have larger pupils. That allows more light in as well as more color. That's why men see about 15 colors. Women distinguish between thousands of colors. See, men talk about gray and blue and purple and brown. Women talk about pewter, periwinkle, magenta, and taupe. Now, I'm going to bet that most men didn't even know how to spell taupe before they got here tonight. And I know that for a reason. But even though females are better at discerning different colors, males excel at tracking fast-moving objects because they have 25% more neurons in their visual cortex, which is located somewhere back here. And this is why men tend to be better at video games, women tend to be better at decorating. Now, having said that, I don't mean to suggest that men can't be artists and women can't hit a moving object. The fact that you recognize Leonardo and Venus just by their first names tells you that both of them have done okay. But for 6,000 years of human history, to stay alive, people have had to be hunters and gatherers. And because of their eyesight, men have tended to be the hunters. And because of their color discernment, women have tended to be the gatherers. Now, this may seem insignificant to you, but let me tell you how valuable this is. My wife once sent me out for chives because she was making mashed potatoes for the grandsons. And I said, "What is a chive?" And she explained it, and so I went out to the garden and cut up some green growing things, came in, washed them off, chopped them up, and threw them in the mashed potato bowl. My wife is now mashing them up when suddenly she says, "Something doesn't look right. Take a look at this. Is this the right green?" And I probably said something really intelligent like, "Green is green." She said, "No, something isn't right." So she got out a spoon, scooped some of them up, said, "This tastes bitter. Show me where you found these green growing things." So I took her out to the garden, and it turns out that I had picked some crocus. Now, take away the flower, and I think crocus and chives look a lot alike, don't they? Maybe. Here's the problem with crocus. Whereas chives have a mild onion flavor, crocus causes burning of the mouth and throat, vomiting, diarrhea, kidney problems, blood disorders, nerve problems, organ failure, and death. So, what did my wife save us from? You name it. And it depends on how many you eat, and if you've seen my grandsons eat mashed potatoes, they'd have probably eaten themselves to death. But her color discernment is what saved the day. And so I'm glad God made men and women differently. Did you know that women taste better than men? Or should I rephrase that? Yes, it is true. Women do have more taste buds, and therefore they have about a 25% better sense of taste than men, which, as you know, came in very handy at our house with the mashed potatoes. And if you look at that diagram of the taste bud, the wonderful thing about it is that the taste buds never wear out. See, about every 10 to 14 days, this taste receptor cell is replaced by a basal cell, which then hooks into the taste pore and becomes the new taste receptor cell. Am I glad, though, that brain cells don't turn over that fast? Can you imagine trying to memorize your Social Security number every other week? Oh. So we have to ask, though, why didn't God give men the same sense of taste? Well, that's because hungry soldiers can't be choosy. Most of you know that the Civil War ended when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. What you probably don't know is that in the days and weeks ahead of the surrender, the Confederate Army had run out of food, and the soldiers were living on grass and bugs. Can you imagine a woman with her very sensitive taste buds existing on grass and bugs? You know, men weren't too happy about it either, but they managed it. So there is an advantage sometimes to not having such a sensitive taster. And we can maybe say some of the same about smell. It is true that women smell better than men. I think everybody will agree. But I didn't know how much better women smelled until one day I came back from lunch. I had gone to my favorite diner and sat too close to the kitchen. And so I came back smelling of something, be it onions, garlic, or whatever. Well, every woman in my office felt it was her duty to tell me how bad I smelled. Okay? In fact, the last one to tell me was the one who had just seated my patient for the afternoon. And she said, now you just go in there and apologize for the way you smell and tell him you will reschedule the appointment. I thought, boy, is it that bad? So I walked in and talked to Tom, who was a middle-aged man, maybe a little older than I was at the time. And I said, Tom, I am really sorry for the way I smell. If you want to reschedule, that's fine. What do you think he said to me? What smell? He couldn't tell, yet every woman in the office thought the whole building was about to go up in flames over the way I smelled. So yes, women do have a much more sensitive sniffer. And that's because of the two olfactory bulbs, which are located right above the nasal cavity. This is kind of where the nose connects to the brain. Females have about twice the number of 50% more neurons than a man has. So in other words, they smell way, way better than any man could ever dream of. And that comes in handy because there are some important smells that are better off if they're detected earlier than later. Smoke, gas, mold, spoiled food, and of course, poopy diapers. I swear my wife could walk into a room and tell it was our kid out of 30 who had the bad diaper. So, why didn't God give men such a good sense of smell? Well, somebody's got to deal with these little guys, especially when they die in your window well. Ask me how I know. But there's an even bigger reason. You see, the smell from thousands of rotting corpses has to be way worse than a skunk. These pictures were taken after the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day of battle in American history. And can you imagine trying to clean up that many corpses and the smell that must have been coming up? You know, it would have made most of the men throw up. Think about a woman with a sensitive sniffer. The saddest thing about the Battle of Antietam is that it should have ended the Civil War. No, I'm not going to ad-lib about the Civil War. We'll be here all night. But there's quite a story with that, and it's just a sad situation. Hearing, likewise, is different between males and females, but not because the ears are different. It's because sound is processed differently within the brain. It seems that women process sound with their white matter, and they process sound using both sides of their brain. Men, on the other hand, use their gray matter and just process sound on one side, usually their left side. Now, this means a whole lot of things with a lot of ramifications, And so we're not going to go into all of them, which is good because I don't understand most of them anyway. The ones I do understand are these. Women are far more capable of hearing a higher pitched sound than a man is. And that's good because they can hear the sounds of children at play or the child who thinks he's being imprisoned and wants to get out. Men tend to hear lower pitched sounds, like the sounds of danger. And it's just the way we are. And I'd leave it at that, except then somebody showed me an interesting study involving kids on a playground. It seems that they put a tape recorder out there and listen to the sounds of boys and girls. And somehow they could tell which was which on the tape recording. And what they discovered was that other than a few shrieks and screams, every time the girls opened their mouths, it was an attempt at intelligible words. They were trying to communicate 100% of the time. With boys, it was only 58%. The other 42% was some combination of groans and grunts and guttural noises and animal noises and truck and car noises and some sounds that had no correlation to any known entity. In other words, boys make noise just to make noise. And I have 8 grandsons and only 1 granddaughter, so I am very well aware of this. But something told me there's more to it than this. And I didn't quite understand it until my oldest grandson's first JV football game. And before the start, the kicker shouted as loud as he could so that everybody in the stands could hear, "Muskego Warriors, what is your profession?" And in total unison, the 10 kids lined up on the 35-yard line shouted, "Ahoo!" Clearly, they were trying to intimidate the other team. Well, it must have worked because my grandson's team scored a lot of touchdowns that year. And after every one, they did the same routine, every game without fail. Well, about the 4th or 5th game, I began to see something, and I caught on, and it helped me to correlate it with the sounds that the boys were making on the playground. And I came to this conclusion, that females use their voices to communicate, and males use their voices to intimidate. Now, not all the time, but often enough to say, "Hey world, look at me. I'm somebody you need to reckon with." Now, why is intimidation important for a boy? Well, I'm going to tell you about my friend Frank. Now, Frank is one of those guys who, whenever he spoke, he kind of snarled. A lot like Marlon Brando in The Godfather. Now, Frank also had a long Italian last name. Now, Frank was no more connected to the mafia than I am. But he didn't tell people that. He let them think anything they wanted to think. Now, one day, Frank's daughter and her children showed up at his house. The abusive ex-husband had threatened her and the kids physically. So they came to Frank's house for safety, and Frank, being the father he was, felt it was his job to protect his kids and his grandkids. The problem was that this ex-son-in-law was 6 inches taller, 40 pounds heavier, and 25 years younger. So what was Frank supposed to do? Well, he didn't have long to think about it because no sooner had they arrived and the phone rang. And he could hear from a distance that it was the ex-husband, and he was reading his ex-wife the riot act, using every 4-letter word he could think of. Well, Frank's daughter just held with the phone like that, so Frank could hear every word that was being said. And then all of a sudden, he took a breath. He just stopped long enough for Frank to say to his daughter, "Ask him what size of shoes he wears." The guy heard it on the other end, and he used a few more 4-letter words, and then said, "What does he want to know that for?" And that's when Frank said to his daughter, "I need to know how much concrete to order." And then there was silence. Frank said, I think the silence lasted an hour, but it was probably only about 10 seconds. But the silence was only broken by the click as he hung up on the other end of the line, and they never heard from him again. From that point on, all the talking he needed to do, he did through the attorney to make sure he didn't say the wrong thing. Intimidation. It's a good thing because it's better than a fist fight, and it's better than a gunfight. And for some reason, men figure out how to do this very young. Now, here's the catch, though. Both Frank and my grandson and his teammates all had intimidating voices because of the testosterone surge they got at puberty that made their Adam's apple bigger. But what about the boys back on the playground? They were nowhere near puberty. They had no more testosterone than the girls on the playground. Why were they running around making all those intimidating noises? Could it be that God has put something in their DNA to make them protectors, and that they practice this from little on, this whole thing of intimidation? If that's the case, what a rip-off testosterone therapy is. What a scam. You see, it doesn't change the DNA, nor does it change the hardwiring that God puts into place in a male or a female. And all this testosterone can do for a woman is make her muscles a little stronger and make her voice a little deeper. It doesn't change the fact that she was not born to be an intimidator. She was born to be something quite different. Now, having said that, I'm not going to say that women cannot be intimidating. My friend Lucy Pavelko is very intimidating. I have 6 inches on her and close to 80 to 100 pounds, and I'm scared to death to fight against her because she would whoop me in 30 seconds flat, probably less. She has taken very good care of herself. She has an outstanding physical condition, and she spars with men who are 20 and 40 and 60 pounds heavier than her. There's no way I want to mess with her. Her dad told me he used to walk down the street with her to keep her protected. Now he walks down the street with her for his protection. But here's the thing about Lucy, is that no matter what kind of shape she's in, the United States military had to lower its standards to allow people like her to fight on the front lines. A finely conditioned man is still way tougher on the battlefield than a finely conditioned woman. Now, I know some people are thinking, well, it doesn't feel fair that a woman can't go out and fight for her country and die for her country just like the men. It's kind of a weird statement, though, isn't it? Well, is it really fair to send a woman out to fight against somebody who did not have to have the standards lowered for them to fight on the battlefield? And what if it's true that the Chinese are cloning millions of young men to be bigger and stronger and faster than anybody they will ever face on the battlefield? Is it fair to send our young women out to fight against them? You know, sometimes it's not about feelings of fairness. Sometimes it's just good, sound, objective reality. And sometimes we need to pay attention to that. And nobody is usually worse off when we do. Speaking of DNA, did you know that the human body contains approximately 100 trillion cells? Now, take my word for it, because it would take you about 600,000 years to count that high. So, of those 100 trillion cells, about half of them are red blood cells. Now, before these red blood cells get put into practice, they are stripped of their nucleus so that they can carry more oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients to the other 50 trillion cells. So That means that your body has about 50 trillion cells that contain DNA. And of those 50 trillion cells that contain DNA, each one is certifiably male or female. Each one of them has either the XX chromosome or the XY chromosome. There's no mixing. There's nothing in between. Talk about binary. That's as binary as it gets. Now, Jerry Bergman says, out of the many thousands of experiments so far completed, no researcher has ever found a single genetic trait that is identical in both males and females. The science is clear. Biological males and females are facts of life. So can your DNA be trusted? Well, it was Bill Gates who said, DNA is like a computer software, only far more sophisticated and complex. Now, I think you know who Bill Gates is. He's a guy who made billions of dollars selling computer software. He ought to know. And when you think about it, your computer really is pretty reliable. The biggest problem is not the computer software, it's the operator error. So is DNA reliable? Well, this is 6 celebrity mothers and their daughters. And this DNA is so reliable that it did what it was supposed to, produce offspring who look an awful lot like the parent. Now, I have no idea who these celebrities are. Maybe somebody else knows. But they certainly look alike, don't they? The problem, of course, is that transgender ideology. It says it's not about science, it's about your feelings. Gender is fluid. We can't choose our gender, or we can choose our gender because it is based on subjective feelings. The concept of gender is different from biological sex. Gender identity is a feeling of maleness or femaleness. Gender dysphoria feels different for everyone. It can feel like anger, sadness, anxiety, or it's just a feeling that part of you is missing. Gender dysphoria, it's all about feelings. And I'm not knocking feelings. Feelings are good. They are a gift from God that the theory of evolution cannot begin to explain. Feelings like love and joy and gratitude and excitement, these are the things we live for. It's the things that make life feel worthwhile. The problem is, as Diana Ross and the Supremes once told us, one day you're up, one day you're down. Next day your world is tumbling round. Raise your hand if you'd like me to sing that for you. Oh, please, put those hands down. The problem is it's not one day you're up or down. It's really one moment you're up or down. Feelings can turn on a dime. How can we trust something that changes that often? And it was Gavin Peacock, a professional soccer player turned evangelist. How's that for a title? He says, never let subjective feelings override objective scientific reality. Those are some words to live by. And it's unfortunate that so much of what you hear in the media tells you trust your feelings. And it's really quite the opposite. Enjoy your feelings, but don't trust them. You see, when subjective feelings override objective scientific reality, the result is usually a hot mess. You better believe those kids enjoyed painting the living room. I'm guessing they didn't enjoy the encounter with their mother afterwards. Problem is that the very definition of gender dysphoria suggests that its victims are emotionally distressed. They are literally a hot mess. Now, I'm sorry if that sounds a little harsh, but to be considered gender dysphoric requires a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, maybe even suicidality. How else do you describe a hot mess? And there is a penalty to be paid when someone allows subjective feelings to override objective scientific reality. And this comes from a Swedish study that has been quoted often. These are people who went through hormone therapy and gender surgery. And after all of that, there's a higher overall mortality rate than for the control group. There's an increased risk for suicide attempts, an increased death rate from suicide, almost 20 times the control group, a higher demand for inpatient psychiatric care, and then number 5, a higher incidence of criminal convictions for female to male transitioners. For example, Audrey Hale, the Nashville school shooter. Female to male transitioner. You wonder, at some point, did she just get too much testosterone and did it put her over the edge? When you combine that with all the things that led to the gender dysphoria, they're not talking about it yet. I think we're all wanting to know more about it. But you combine all of that together, and this is part of the irreversible damage caused by the transgender craze that is seducing our daughters and, I've added, our granddaughters. This is a book written by Abigail Schreier. If you are interested at all in the subject, it's a really good read. Abigail wrote that 3 years ago. She didn't know about the Nashville shooter then, because this too is part of the irreversible damage caused by the transgender craze that is seducing our daughters and our young people. 6, needless deaths. So what's driving the transgender craze? Well, the goal is to erase all differences between males and females, as well as to eradicate biological and eternal truths. Ultimately, these goals will fail. The question is, how high will the body count be by the time they finally do? This was spoken by Dr. Miriam Grossman, a child psychiatrist who has been a close observer of what's going on with gender treatment. Dr. Miriam Grossman is a good Jewish woman. I wonder how she'd feel about the fact that she came real close to quoting the New Testament. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Doesn't this sound like a pretty good answer to the question of what is driving the transgender craze? So, some final thoughts. Why is God so binary? Well, reason number 3. God is in a category all by himself. God wants us to comprehend objective reality. The objective reality is that he is God and we are not. In reality, God is exceedingly distinct from anything and everyone that has ever existed. So what does this mean? Well, it means that there is the divine and there is the ordinary. Just look at this diagram of the Holy Trinity. And this is what the Bible describes for us: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But do any of us really understand what this means? I think the Holy Trinity is way above our pay grade. I'm kind of glad that it is, because I want to think that God is way beyond just a larger version of us. That means that everybody else is part of the ordinary. It means that the best and the worst of human beings are way more like each other than they are like God. And any one of us fits into that same category. We are way more like Billy Graham, and we are way more like Adolf Hitler than we are like God. Binary also means that there's the created universe and there's the creator of the universe. You see, God created the entire universe, but he is not part of it. He is totally separate from it. And just think about the way God created. He said, let there be birds. And we didn't just get a male and female version of Big Bird. God said, let there be birds. And every color and size and shape of birds suddenly appeared in the sky. All very similar and yet all quite unique. And when God said, let there be fish, he didn't go searching for Nemo. When he said, let there be fish, fish filled the oceans and the lakes and the rivers, fish of every size and shape and color. And when God said, let there be stars, we didn't get one little twinkling star. What we got was the biggest thing that we will ever see with our naked eyes. But we think the sun is just this really big thing out there. What in the universe could be larger? Well, I was surprised to find out how much more is larger. Go ahead, Paul. And God created all of that, didn't he? Genesis 1:16. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. He said that so casually, so matter-of-factly, you would have almost expected the next verse to say, and then he poured a bowl of Cheerios and sat down to eat his breakfast. That's how casually it was for him. It's just one more reminder that he is God and we are not. Binary also means that there's the natural and the supernatural. You know, even though God created nature, and even though God permeates nature, and even though he supervises nature, he's not part of the natural world. In fact, he is also not subject to the laws of nature. Now, personally, I'm glad about that. God can override the laws of nature anytime he wants, and he did that for me about 40 years ago when he told me no more alcohol. But sometimes he just tampers with the laws of nature. He did that for me last Thursday night. I had done a trial run of the presentation with my wife, but I went to bed saying to myself, I don't know how to finish it. I said, God, would you show me somehow how to finish it? And I woke up the next morning thinking of 1981. Now, didn't think about anything that happened in 1981. I just thought 1981. And that's when I had to put my thinking cap on and say, what happened in 1981? Well, that's when I was locked in spiritual warfare. I had no idea that's what they called it at that time. But there was a battle going on between Jesus and Charles Darwin. There was a battle going on in my life between John chapter 1 and the theory of evolution. You see, I knew that I wanted the forgiveness that only Jesus could offer. But I also knew that Jesus was creator. And how could I trust him as Lord and Savior if I couldn't believe he was the creator? The problem was that after 7 years of so-called higher education, I thoroughly believed that evolution was the best answer. Well, the battle ended providentially when I surrendered to God because he overwhelmed me with objective scientific reality. He showed me that evolution was a lie and that Jesus Christ was the truth. And once victory was declared, I asked God, what am I supposed to do next? Well, to find the answer to that, I read a little further in the book of John. And then one day, the answer jumped off the pages at me. And God kept the answer simple. God kept it binary. He gave me a very simple to-do list. From John 6:29, believe in Jesus. And I'll say that to anyone who's here tonight. Whatever is bugging you today, whatever bugs you tomorrow, start with a to-do list that has on it, believe in Jesus. And sooner or later, you'll fix the problem. And I was going to leave it at that, but then I remembered something else from 1981. Pastor Stuart Briscoe of Elmbrook Church, who passed away about 6 months ago, he once said, someday God is going to speak to you, and once you realize that this amazing, almighty, merciful, supreme being has spoken to you, your life will never be the same. That was 42 years ago, and my life has never been the same. And I can't tell you how many of my old friends would be absolutely amazed that I'm standing in front of a church tonight, doing my best to convince everyone here that evolution is a lie and Jesus Christ is the truth. Would you join me in prayer? Our Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for being an amazing, merciful, almighty God who loves his creation, who loves the people he created, so much so that you sent your Son Jesus to die in our place. Father, please send us from this place more aware than ever about who you are. You are the absolute master of the universe. You are in a category all your own. And help us to revere you as we ought to, and help us to share this gospel that you've given us, that others might believe as well. We thank you in Jesus' precious, holy, righteous name. Amen. Thank you.